Hey, have you ever stopped to think about how easily information just seems to, well, vanish?
Oh, absolutely.
If you cram for something, you feel totally prepared, right?
Yeah.
And then maybe a day or two later, it's like trying to grab smoke.
Mm-hmm.
I saw this wild stat within like 48 hours of really intense cramming. We can forget up to half of what we just learned.
Half. That's huge.
But then compare that to, a different way, like actively testing yourself as you go along.
Right. Retrieval practice.
Yeah. People who do that, they tend to remember way more. They only lose maybe 10 to 20% in the same time.
That's a massive difference.
It really makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about learning, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And what that stark difference really highlights is, well, a fundamental flaw in how we think we learn and remember best. Our intuition can be pretty off.
We mistake that feeling of familiarity maybe from just rereading notes over and over.
Exactly that sense of, oh, yeah, I've seen this. We mistake that for actual mastery, for actually being able to pull that info out when we need it.
And that's exactly what we're going to dig into today for you. We're going to cut through all the noise and get straight to it, what the research says really works for making information stick.
Mm-hmm.
Our main source for this deep dive is the book Make It Stick.
Mm.
It's a really fascinating read put together by cognitive scientists Henry Roediger and Mark McDaniel, and also Peter Brown, who kind of brings a storytelling flair to it all.
Yeah, and what's so valuable about Make It Stick, I think, is its foundation. It wasn't just one or two people. It was a whole collaboration of 11 cognitive psychologists.
Wow, 11.
Yeah, all focused on taking decades of solid research and translating it into, practical, usable strategies that anyone can actually apply to learn better.
Okay, so our mission here today, for you listening, is pretty straightforward, but hopefully super useful. We're going to pull out the most important, maybe some surprising, and definitely the immediately useful insights from this book about how your brain actually learns and holds on to information.
Think of it as a shortcut.
Yeah, exactly. A shortcut to getting that knowledge locked in without feeling totally overwhelmed by like endless hours of studying. Okay, so one of the first things that really jumped out at me, made me go, huh, was this idea they call the illusions of knowing. What's the deal with that?
Right, the illusions of knowing. It's that really tricky feeling where something feels familiar, so we just assume we know it well. Like you said, rereading notes gives you this sense of fluency, right? Yeah, I've seen this. But that feeling, it doesn't actually guarantee you can pull that information out of your brain later when it counts.
So familiarity isn't mastery.
Not at all. And that's where the power of actively trying to retrieve information comes in. That's what the authors call retrieval practice.
Right. It's like knowing about something isn't the same as truly knowing it. They use this great analogy in the book. A pilot in a flight simulator facing an emergency. They might have read the procedures, a dozen times, but in that high-pressure moment, actually having to retrieve and execute those steps, that's what reveals the real depth of their understanding. Or maybe the lack of it.
Exactly. It's a real-time check on what's truly internalized. And that act, just the attempt to retrieve information, does two really powerful things. First, it shines a spotlight on what you don't know yet or what you don't fully understand. Shows you where to focus.
Okay, identifies the gaps.
Right. And second, and this is really key, when you successfully recall something, your brain actually strengthens the neural pathways for that memory. It makes it easier to access later.
Ah, like making a path clearer in the woods.
Precisely. The more you walk it, the clearer it gets. That process, strengthening the memory trace through recall, is called reconsolidation.
Reconsolidation.
Got it.
That makes a lot of sense. And they share this really eye-opening study with 8th grade science students.
Oh yeah, the Columbia, Illinois study?
That's the one. Some students just reread the material, the usual way.
Yeah.
But others were quizzed on it.
Simple quizzes, nothing high stakes.
Right. And then a month later, the kids who were quizzed remembered the information much, much better. It wasn't even close.
Yeah, that study really drives home the point. Actively engaging, pulling the information out through retrieval is just far more effective for long-term learning than passively reselling it again and again.
It reminds me of that quote from Second Lieutenant Callie Hunkler in the book. She used practice tests. What did she call it?
Shooting an azimuth, like using a compass reading.
Yeah, to get a clear reading on her understanding and then adjust where she needed to study more.
It's a great metaphor for using retrieval to guide your learning.
So for you listening, if you want to learn efficiently and actually remember stuff, this idea of retrieval practice is huge. It's about actively pulling things out of your head, not just passively pouring it in.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, now, another big concept they talk about is elaboration, making connections. What's the magic behind that?
Elaboration is essentially about giving new information meaning. How? By linking it to stuff you already know.
Okay.
It's about explaining the new material, maybe in your own words, and finding those bridges, those connections to your existing knowledge base. Think of it like building a richer, more interconnected web in your brain.
The book points out something interesting here, that while our short-term memory definitely has limits, we've all felt that brain full feeling.
Oh,
right?
yeah, information overload.
But there's really no known limit to how much we can learn through elaboration.
Mm.
It's not just about cramming more facts, and it's about creating more and stronger links between those facts.
Exactly. The more ways you can connect new information to what's already there, the stronger it'll stick. And crucially, the more cues you'll have to retrieve it later on.
Makes sense.
They use some great everyday examples in the book, like thinking about how warm air holds more moisture. That helps explain why your air conditioner drips in the summer.
Oh, right. Or those big afternoon thunderstorms.
Precisely. Or comparing, say, the dry heat in Phoenix, where sweat evaporates really fast and cools you down, to the sticky, humid air in Atlanta, where sweat just kind of sits there because it can't evaporate easily. That connects an abstract idea like evaporation to a very real physical feeling.
Those real-world links are so powerful, aren't they? Taking something abstract and grounding it in your own experience.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got retrieval and elaboration. Now let's talk about when we learn. We all know the temptation to cram.
The all-nighter.
Yeah, but make it stick strongly argues for spaced practice.
Yeah.
Why is spreading things out so much better than one massive study session?
Spaced practice really taps into how our memory works over time. See, when you space out your learning, you actually allow yourself to forget a little bit between sessions.
Forget. That sounds bad.
Huh, it sounds counterintuitive, I know. But that slight forgetting actually makes the effort of retrieving the information in the next session a bit more challenging. And that extra effort, that desirable difficulty we'll talk more about, it re-triggers that memory consolidation process, strengthening the memory trace even more. It's like giving your brain a little workout each time you revisit the material instead of one exhausting marathon.
Okay, so the effort of remembering after a gap makes it stick better.
Yeah.
They mentioned a study, I think, from 1978.
Yes, the one comparing massed practice, cramming, versus spaced intervals.
Right. After just 2 days, the cramming group had forgotten about half of it. But the spaced practice group, they'd only forgotten around 13%.
13 versus 50%. That's a huge difference in retention just from changing when you study.
It really is. And wasn't there another study with 60 objects or something?
Yeah, where people learned a list of 60 concrete objects. It showed that repeated testing over time, spaced out, acted almost like a vaccine against forgetting in the long run.
The vaccine against forgetting. I like that.
So by revisiting information at increasing intervals, you're basically signaling to your brain, hey, this stuff is important, keep it accessible. And honestly, this approach is more respectful of your time. Shorter, focused sessions spread out are way more effective than one long, draining cram session.
Absolutely. Quality over quantity, spaced out. Now, building on this idea of varying your learning, make it stick, introduces interleaved practice. This was kind of a newer one for me. How's it different from just spacing things out?
Okay, so interleaving is specifically about mixing up the types of things you're learning or practicing within a single study session.
Mixing them up, like...
So instead of doing, say, all your algebra problems in one big block and then switching to all your geometry problems.
Which is how most people study, probably.
Right. With interleaving, you'd mix them up, maybe do an algebra problem, then a geometry problem, then another algebra, then maybe back to geometry. You're switching between different subjects or skills.
That sounds almost less organized, like it would feel slower.
It does feel less efficient while you're doing it. You're right. When you're constantly switching gears, you might not feel like you're making rapid progress in any one area.
Yeah, I could see that being frustrating.
But here's the kicker. The research consistently shows that for long-term retention, and maybe more importantly, for being able to apply your knowledge flexibly in different situations, interleaving is incredibly effective.
Really? More effective, even if it feels harder.
Yes. There's a great study in the book with college students learning the volumes of different geometric solids like wedges, spheres, cones.
Oh, yeah.
One group practiced block style, all the sphere problems, then all the cone problems, etc. The other group did interleaved practice, mixing all the types together. During the practice sessions, the blocked group did better. They felt like they were learning faster.
Makes sense.
But on the final test, a week later, The interleaved group scored significantly higher. Their ability to actually calculate the volumes correctly was dramatically better.
Wow. So the initial struggle paid off later.
Exactly. And the book mentions similar findings for learning things like identifying different artists' painting styles or even distinguishing between different types of birds.
So the act of having to constantly discriminate to figure out which type of problem or concept it is, that strengthens the understanding of each one.
Precisely. It forces your brain to actively compare and contrast, leading to a deeper level of understanding and a better ability to tell similar but different things apart. Even though it might feel slower or more challenging during learning, the long-term benefits are substantial.
Okay, so we've got retrieval, elaboration, spacing, interleaving, active stuff. Now, let's touch on learning from what we've already done. The book emphasizes reflection. It sounds almost too simple, but how does just, thinking about past experiences help us learn better?
Reflection is actually a really powerful form of active processing. It's not passive navel-gazing. It involves deliberately taking a step back to think about something you've experienced. Maybe a lecture, a problem you tackled, a project you finished. You ask yourself questions like, okay, what actually happened? What went well? What could I have done differently? By doing that, you're actively engaging with the experience, processing it, and extracting valuable lessons that can actually change how you approach things next time.
There's that anecdote in the book about the neurosurgeon, Mike Ebersold.
Oh, yeah, the suturing story.
Right.
Yeah.
He reflected on a really difficult suturing experience and ended up developing a completely new technique because of that reflection. It's pretty compelling.
It really shows how that deliberate thought after an event can lead to real, tangible improvements. And there's also Doug Larson's research mentioned.
In medical training.
Yeah, incorporating structured reflection, having medical students write maybe daily or weekly summaries of their experiences. The idea is that making reflection a regular habit can be just as crucial as things like testing for developing true expertise. It helps solidify the learning from real-world practice.
It's like creating your own personal feedback loop, constantly refining based on what you've actually gone through. Okay, now this next idea sounds a bit counterintuitive again. Embracing difficulties. Why would we want learning to be harder?
Yeah, it goes against our instinct to seek the path of least resistance. But the authors introduce this really important concept of desirable difficulties.
Desirable difficulty.
These are challenges during the learning process that might, slow down your initial progress, make things feel tougher. But ultimately, they lead to deeper, stronger, more durable learning.
So things like spacing and interleaving, which we just talked about.
Yeah.
Those are desirable difficulties.
Exactly. And also, the act of trying to generate an answer yourself before seeing it that effort is a desirable difficulty, too.
The story of Mia Blondetto at jump school really brought this home for me.
Oh, yeah, the Army jump school example.
Each stage of her training deliberately ramped up the difficulty, right? It forced her to actively recall and apply what she'd learned in increasingly stressful situations.
Yeah.
That struggle, while probably not fun at the time,
Definitely not fun.
it was clearly essential for her to actually master those skills.
Precisely. That effortful retrieval, even when you stumble or make mistakes along the way, is what strengthens the underlying memory. It's fundamentally different from just passively rereading or rapid-fire repetition, which often relies mostly on short-term memory. The book also makes a fascinating point that some amount of forgetting is actually necessary for new learning.
How so?
Well, think about switching computer systems, maybe from a PC to a Mac, or learning a new software program. You often have to actively suppress or unlearn the old ways of doing things to really master the new system.
Right, your old habits get in the way.
Exactly. And even in related fields, like the example of Army jump school versus smoke jumping, the techniques are different enough that the prior Army training could actually be a disadvantage for a smoke jumper if they don't adapt. Forgetting the old procedure is crucial.
So it's about pushing through that initial feeling of, this is hard, and recognizing that the struggle itself often means deeper learning is happening. It really loops back to that earlier point. Our gut feeling about what feels like effective learning can often be misleading.
Absolutely. That effortful recall is a vital part of that reconsolidation process we mentioned, making memories stronger and more accessible down the road.
Okay, so we're embracing the struggle. Now, you mentioned generation just now. Let's unpack that. What's the power in trying to come up with answers ourselves, even before we know them?
Generation is simply the act of trying to answer a question or solve a problem before you're shown the actual answer or the solution.
Even if you get it wrong.
Yes, even if your initial attempt is completely wrong, the very act of trying to generate an answer engages your brain much more actively than just passively receiving the information. And that active engagement makes you much more likely to remember the correct information when you do eventually see or hear it.
I think they used the example of trying to remember the capital of Texas,
Right. Even if you guess, say, Dallas or Houston first.
which are plausible guesses.
Exactly. The mental effort you expend trying to retrieve that fact makes you much more likely to really lock in the correct answer, Austin, by the way, when you finally hear it.
It's like you've primed your brain, created a space for that specific piece of information to slot into.
That's a great way to put it. Those unsuccessful attempts actually create a more fertile ground for encoding the correct information when it arrives. It sticks much better than if you'd just been passively told the capital of Texas is Austin right from the start.
And this ties in nicely with another point they make, doesn't it? That making mistakes isn't necessarily a bad thing when you're learning.
Oh, absolutely. Make it stick really emphasizes this. Making errors, provided you get corrective feedback afterward.
That feedback part is crucial.
Crucial, making errors with feedback is actually a really valuable part of the learning process. You don't learn the errors themselves. Instead, the feedback helps you refine your understanding, correct misconceptions, and strengthen the right pathways.
So we shouldn't be afraid to guess or try, even if we might be wrong.
Exactly. People who understand that learning inherently involves some struggle, some mistakes, are generally more willing to tackle difficult problems. They see mistakes not as failures, but as, data points, opportunities to learn and adjust.
They mentioned that French initiative,
Yeah.
the Festival of Errors.
Yes. Aimed at teaching school children that mistakes are a constructive, normal part of learning. It's about shifting the mindset around errors.
That's great. Even Steve Jobs has mentioned viewing his firing from Apple.
As a period of immense creative growth, ultimately leading to NXT and Pixar and his return to Apple, mistakes can be powerful catalysts.
It's about reframing errors, seeing them as stepping stones, not roadblocks. Okay, let's tackle a really common topic. Learning styles. The idea that I'm a visual learner, you're an auditory learner, someone else is kinesthetic. What does the research in Make It Stick say about tailoring learning to these supposed styles?
Yeah, this is a big one. The book directly addresses the very popular concept of learning styles and, frankly, pours some cold water on it.
Oh.
The current body of research, based on rigorous studies, just doesn't really support the idea that tailoring instruction to a student's self-reported or perceived learning style actually leads to better learning outcomes.
Really? But it feels so intuitive. Like, I prefer seeing diagrams.
Right, we all have preferences for how information is presented. But a major review of the research, led by Pashler and colleagues, looked specifically for evidence that this kind of mashing visual methods for visual learners, etc., actually improves learning. And they found a lack of solid empirical evidence supporting it.
Wow. Okay, that's probably surprising for a lot of listeners. So the takeaway isn't to ignore preferences entirely, but
not to rely on them as the key to effective learning. The evidence suggests that the effective strategies we've been discussing, retrieval practice, spacing, interleaving, elaboration, these are beneficial for all learners, regardless of their preferred style.
so focus on the strategy, not the style.
Pretty much. The authors do briefly mention Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence, thinking about analytical, creative, and practical strengths as perhaps a more research-supported way to view cognitive differences compared to the often oversimplified and rigid learning styles categories.
Interesting. But they do talk about some cognitive differences that do seem to impact learning, right?
Yay.
Like this idea of structure building.
Yes, absolutely. Structure building is a concept that does seem to reflect a genuine difference in how people learn. It refers to an individual's ability to sort of sift through new information, identify the key ideas, the main points, and then organize those ideas into a coherent mental framework.
Like building a mental model.
Exactly. People who are naturally good structure builders tend to learn new material more effectively because they can quickly create that strong mental scaffolding to hang new details on. The Lego analogy they use is helpful figuring out the key bricks and how they fit together.
That makes sense. Creating a clear mental blueprint first. And they also mentioned a difference between rule learners and example learners.
Right, another cognitive difference observed in research. Rule learners tend to focus on abstracting the general principles or rules from new information. Example learners, on the other hand, tend to learn best by studying lots of specific examples and then generalizing from those patterns.
Is one better than the other?
Not necessarily better, just different approaches. Interestingly, research suggests example learners can become better rule learners if they're prompted to actively compare different examples and look for the underlying commonalities.
Ah, so you can nudge people towards seeing the bigger picture.
Yes. And similarly, getting people to compare seemingly different problems can help them see the underlying structural similarity and apply the same core solution principle. The classic example is the tumor problem and the fortress problem.
Right, different stories, same underlying logic. It's about getting past the surface details.
Exactly, grasping those deeper transferable principles.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly. Memory aids mnemonic devices. We've all heard of things like acronyms or rhymes. What role do these play in real, effective, long-term learning, according to the book?
Mnemonic devices are basically mental tools, little tricks we can use to help store and retrieve specific pieces of information more easily. They can be acronyms like ROIGBIV for the colors of the rainbow, or
Right.
rhymes, or more complex visualization techniques like the method of loci or the memory palace.
Mary Palaces sound fancy.
They can be quite powerful. The book mentions James Patterson, who initially learned mnemonics hoping for a study shortcut, but he realized pretty quickly that while they are fantastic for recalling information you've already learned, they don't necessarily help you understand the underlying concepts in the first place. They're about retrieval, not deep comprehension on their own.
So they're good for remembering lists or sequences,
Yeah.
like the Mark Twain example, using his driveway landmarks to teach his kids the order of English monarchs.
Exactly. Or the psychology students using a memory palace to mentally walk through and recall the main points for an essay. Mnemonics essentially create strong retrieval cues, mental hooks to hang learned information on so it's easier to pull back out later.
So useful tools for recall, but not a substitute for the effortful learning strategies like elaboration and retrieval practice needed for understanding.
Precisely. They help you access what you've already worked to understand.
Got it. Okay, we're covering so much great stuff. Let's briefly touch on the brain itself. Make It Stick talks about neuroplasticity and also growth mindset. How do these big ideas connect to our day-to-day learning?
Well, neuroplasticity is just this incredible fundamental property of our brains. It's the ability to physically change and reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout our entire lives in response to learning and experience.
So our brains aren't fixed.
Not at all. This means our intelligence, our abilities, they aren't set in stone at birth. They can genuinely change and develop. And Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset really builds directly on this.
The fixed versus growth mindset idea.
Right. People with a growth mindset believe their abilities can be developed through dedication, good strategies, and hard work. People with a fixed mindset tend to believe their qualities are innate and unchangeable.
And the growth mindset is better for learning.
Overwhelmingly, yes. The research shows that simply believing you can get smarter makes you more likely to embrace challenges, persist when things get tough, learn from criticism, and ultimately achieve more. There's that study mentioned with 7th graders where just teaching them that their brains can change and grow, teaching them about neuroplasticity actually led to increased motivation and higher academic achievement compared to a control group.
That's really powerful. Just knowing your effort makes a physical difference in your brain can change your approach.
It's incredibly empowering. It underscores that effort works and that using effective strategies truly shapes our capabilities.
And that leads nicely into the concept of deliberate practice. We hear this term a lot, especially regarding experts. How is it different from just, practicing something a lot?
Deliberate practice is a very specific, highly structured form of practice. It's not just mindless repetition. It's always goal-directed. You have a specific aspect of performance you're trying to improve.
Okay.
It's effortful. It pushes you just beyond your current comfort zone and capabilities. It often involves breaking down complex skills into smaller, manageable parts, focusing intently on those parts, getting immediate feedback on your performance, and reflecting on that feedback to make adjustments.
So it's systematic and focused on improvement.
Exactly. The book highlights that expert-level performance in almost any field, music, sports, surgery, chess, typically doesn't come from innate talent alone. It arises from thousands of hours of this kind of focused, deliberate practice, which builds incredibly complex and effective mental models related to that skill.
So it's not just the quantity of practice, but the quality and the focus on getting better.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Wow, we've talked through so many powerful principles. Can we maybe look at some more real-world examples of how these are actually being used? The book seemed packed with them.
Absolutely. It's great to see the theory in action. Remember Matt Brown, the pilot, going through that fire hose training?
Yeah, where information was just dumped on him.
Right. It wasn't sticking. But then an instructor asked a simple question that forced retrieval and a real-world connection. Has anybody here ever had the fuel filter bypass light come on in flight? Suddenly, that abstract knowledge became concrete and memorable because they had to retrieve it and apply it.
Ah, that active retrieval spark.
Exactly. Or think about Coach Vince Dooley's legendary football program at Georgia. His whole weekly structure was built around learning new plays early in the week, then spaced repetition through practice, and then testing that knowledge under pressure in scrimmages. That's spaced retrieval and application built right in.
A weekly cycle of learning and testing.
Yep. And Doug Larson, we mentioned him with Reflection, he also integrated regular low-stakes quizzing into medical education specifically to help students combat the forgetting curve. Andrew Sobel, teaching political economics, used short, ungraded pop quizzes, not primarily for grades, but to incentivize students to keep up with the reading and engage in regular retrieval. It boosted attendance and learning.
And it's not just college or pro sports. You mentioned middle school teachers, too.
Yes, Patrice Bain and John Warenberg saw significant improvements in their middle school social studies and history classes just by incorporating frequent low-stakes quizzes. The kids retained the information much better long-term. Mary Pat Wendroff, teaching biology, cleverly reframed traditional study groups as testing groups.
Testing groups.
Yeah, the focus shifted from passively rereading notes together to actively quizzing each other, working through problems collaboratively, emphasizing recall and application.
That's a smart shift.
Even really established institutions like West Point have used their Thayer method for ages, which heavily features frequent quizzing and having students recite and explain concepts, pure retrieval practice. Kathleen McDermott, teaching a course on learning and memory.
How meta.
Right. She uses daily low-stakes quizzes to give students constant practice retrieving the very concepts they're learning about.
Eating your own dog food, so to speak.
Exactly. And it goes beyond academia. Farmers Insurance redesigned their sales training to incorporate generation, having reps try to solve client problems before learning the standard approach, plus spaced practice and interleaving different sales scenarios.
Makes sense for complex skills like sales.
Jiffy Lube University uses active learning with lots of quizzing and immediate feedback for their technicians. Anderson Windows and Doors has this amazing culture where production workers actually teach managers about process improvements, leveraging the learning benefits of generation and teaching others.
That's fantastic. Empowering the workers and boosting learning.
And then you have individual stories. Timothy Fellows, a psych student who figured out retrieval practice was way better than rereading. Nathaniel Fuller, an actor who learned understudy roles incredibly fast by focusing on retrieval, not just rereading the script. And Young, the medical student who turned his struggles around by shifting from passive review to active recall and self-testing.
Wow. Those examples really cut across so many different fields and levels. It shows how universal these principles really are.
They really are fundamental to how we learn best.
Okay, so as we start to wrap up this really insightful deep dive into Make It Stick, if you had to boil it down, what are maybe the 2 or 3 most impactful takeaways that you think our listeners should really grab onto and try to incorporate into their own learning?
Okay. If I had to pick just a few essentials for you listening, first, absolutely embrace the power of retrieval practice. Make active self-testing, quizzing yourself, trying to recall information without looking at your notes a regular part of how you learn. Remember, it's not just checking what you know, it's one of the most powerful ways to learn more deeply.
Okay, retrieval is number 1.
Second, I'd say understand and even learn to welcome those desirable difficulties. Recognize that when learning feels a bit tough because you're spacing things out or mixing up topics, interleaving, or trying to generate answers yourself, that struggle is often a sign that you're actually building stronger, more lasting understanding. Don't shy away from that productive effort.
Embrace the beneficial struggle.
Got it.
And a third.
And finally, really cultivate a growth mindset. Truly believe that your ability to learn and grow isn't fixed. The science, the neuroplasticity, it backs this up. Your effort, combined with using effective strategies like the ones we've discussed, can significantly change your cognitive abilities. Believing you can improve is half the battle.
Fantastic summaries. Retrieval, desirable difficulties, and growth mindset. So for you, the listener, here's maybe a little challenge. Think about just one or two of these ideas that really resonated, maybe retrieval practice, maybe spacing, and make a conscious effort to just try them out in your learning, maybe even this week.
Start small.
Yeah, exactly. Now that you know how powerful actively recalling information is, what's maybe one specific thing you're learning right now that you can start testing yourself on today, even just for a few minutes? And here's maybe a final thought to chew on. Given that our gut instincts about how we learn best can often be wrong, as we've seen, what's maybe another area of your life where taking a more evidence-based approach rather than just relying on intuition or how things feel might lead to better outcomes or deeper understanding?
That's a great question to ponder.
By understanding these fundamental principles from Make It Stick, you really do have an advantage now, a kind of shortcut to making knowledge last, and hopefully a deeper appreciation for the incredible adaptable power of your own mind.